The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Amen. Well, good morning. It's good to be with you. My name is Thomas, and I serve as one of the pastors here, specifically leading our well contemporary service in the chapel at 11 a.m., but y'all see me every so often. Traditional. I haven't been there in a while, and so later this morning I have the gift of sharing with them as well. So it's good to see you. It's good to be with you. If you would, you've heard the words, but would you turn to Psalm 23? In your Bibles. If you have one of the blue Bibles in the pew back in front of you, that's on page 859. And as we've said each week, it's just good to have the words in front of you, to open the scriptures together as we return to these familiar words. We've spent the whole summer here in Psalm 23, and we've done that for a couple of reasons. One, out of the conviction that these words can change your life. The simple conviction that spending time in this psalm, these simple 6 verses, that these words can change your life. But we've also spent time here because we believe that these words capture the essence of someone's life who has been changed, a heart who has been transformed. And specifically, a heart transformed by living in step with the rhythm that God has woven into creation. We see it in Exodus 20, verse 11. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." A life transformed in the presence of God, returning again and again in the practice of Sabbath to that place. And so we've spent a few months here, and if you'll remember to the beginning of the year, we've spent the summer here because of where we started the year. We started the year looking practically at the teachings of that practice, of how to participate in the ancient practice of keeping and remembering the Sabbath in the life of faith, a practice kept by Jesus. And so we presented it as a challenge, an invitation, and as a church, we've committed this year to participation in that. In small ways or in large ways, to move towards integrating that practice into our life and our life together. A full 24 hours out of our 7 days of the week spent resting, delighting in Jesus and being present with God and one another, to abide in the presence of the Lord, or as verse 6 would describe for us in Psalm 23, to dwell in the house of the Lord. And so all summer we've been in Psalm 23, and as Julian joked last week, if you're sheeped out, your pastors are more sheeped out. There are only so many sheep images, but that's where we've been. We've been experiencing a full year, a cycle of the shepherd leading his flock. And so we begin in verse 1 with the shepherd leading his sheep, leading to green pastures, to still waters, along paths that lead to life, protecting his sheep in the valley of the shadow of death. And in that place, in the shadow, comforting and protecting with the rod and the staff. Claiming the sheep as he anoints their heads with oil, protecting them in the face of enemies and welcoming them. And now this year ends. There's a culmination and an arrival. The sheep are home. They've been brought back. And it's interesting and encouraging to note in these 6 verses that sense of arrival, of getting to a destination, of getting to a place, that was never a burden placed on the sheep. It's exclusively placed on the shepherd to guide and direct and ultimately to bring home his sheep, his flock. The burden for the sheep was simply to follow. And so as we've looked to these words in Psalm 23, David is writing himself into the story as one of the sheep of this shepherd, this good shepherd. And as he reflects on his experience and life in God in this particular way, in this particular song, in Psalm 23, he ends it in this way: I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He says, it's so good here. It's so good here, and I don't intend to go anywhere now that I've found it. My wife, Eden, and I have been talking about whether or not the house that we're currently in is our forever house. Do you know that conversation? Do you ever drive around and you're like, well, maybe there. And we have conversations about this house that we bought a couple of years ago when we moved to Mansfield. Is this where we stay? And how long do we stay in this house? If we were to buy, where would we buy? And what's the market doing? And then we stop talking about that because that makes us sad. But this is a constant conversation in our lives, and usually we turn the conversation to the positives of where we are, the house that we find ourselves in, and we talk about the possibilities of life in this house, and that question usually is leading to the answer of how can we make this house a home? How can we make where we are our home? What can we do to make it ours? What memories can we create? What kind of life and culture in these walls do we want to live within, to raise a family, to build a life in? And so in an effort to make a house a home, we made a significant decision last week, and I want to show you a picture of that decision. Yeah, one awe. Thank you. All laughter because you know what my life is like now. I know I got one awe, but I know that I've made some enemies in the room. Your pastor has cats at his house. I know our senior pastor may be the foremost. But we have Toad and Ray. Toad's on the right. He's my son's, named after Mario and Toad. And Ray, we don't know where the name came from, but our daughter was Resolute. That's Ray. And so we have Ray and Toad. And I've resisted any kind of animal in our house. I only lasted 5 years. It didn't take very long to wear me down. Eden likes cats and dogs, but I've resisted all animals because those things are going to be with us forever. Like, I know that reality, and I know forever for a domesticated American household cat is only like 15 years, but in 15 years, I'll have kids in college, and my oldest kid starts kindergarten next week. That's forever for me. That is forever. I'm going to have to protect them. They can't handle the squirrels outside. I'm going to have to clean up after them. I'm going to have to care and feed for them. I'm going to have to experience allergies from them. I've spent 33 years around cats, but I take 2 into my own home. Allergies. I don't know what that is. But this is the commitment we've made. The arrangement we've committed to make our house a home. And that arrangement, when we set the cats aside, when we think about our family, now they're in our family, I understand that. But when I think about my children, a house becoming a home for them, that's a different thing. I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel known and loved and seen and heard. I want them to have great memories. That's why we got the cats. I want them to experience all that it is to grow up and form memories, to have fun and to learn, to have a wonderful childhood. And after they move out forever in the distance, after they move out, I want them to come back home out of the sense that being with us, being in our presence is where they're most at home. I want that for them. And that's something that I believe we all want. This sense of a place, of a people to belong to be accepted, to be known, more than a physical space, but an awareness and assurance that we have a place. That we have a place to call home, where we can be ourselves, where we can rest. And some of us want that sense of home because we've experienced it and we can't imagine life without it. So we pursue it. Others of us want it because we've never experienced it. And all we've ever known is life without that place to call home. And so we long for it. A place where we're known, where we're loved, the place we can rest. And as we look to the words of David, we can look throughout the Psalms and see his expression of how he describes longing for home. And he wants to find it specifically in a particular place, in the presence of God. That's why he's a model for us in these weeks and these months this summer. So we can see in Psalm 27, David writes this way, describing this longing for home. "One thing I ask from the Lord. This only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord, to seek him in his temple. For in the day of trouble he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his sacred tent and set me high upon a rock." This is where he believes he will find his home. And he continues in a different psalm. In Psalm 84, he writes, "How lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God." To be in that place. And he says the familiar words, "Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked." Would you just let me in? Would you just let me in, Lord, to this place that I long for, a place to call home in your presence? It's the only place I want to be, David writes. A model for us of what to look for in this life, how to define that which we long for. And at the end of Psalm 23, verse 6, "I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." He's saying he's found it. I've experienced it as he's reflecting on the goodness and the mercy of the shepherd who has led him, who will lead him, who will come behind him with goodness and mercy. He says, he describes it in this way. I've found my home. I've found my home, the home I've longed for, and I'm staying here forever. It's so good here. I never want to leave. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Doesn't that sound wonderful? To have found what we have longed for in the presence of God. Some of us want it, again, because we've experienced it. We've experienced the presence of God, and we can't imagine life without it. Others, because we've never experienced it. And all we've known is life without it, and we long to go home. To be found, to be present in the presence of God. And in our desire, in our longing, often we want it so badly that we will search for it anywhere. We'll build our own houses to rest. We're tempted to build places that we can connect. Temporary solutions rooted in misplaced trust. Houses that never amount to homes. And so 2 questions for us this morning as we look to the words of a man who has found his home in God. 2 questions. What does it mean to dwell in the house of the Lord? And how do we find out where he lives? How do we find what David has found? And so we have a few images throughout Scripture that help us see the progression of how we can locate the presence of God. And the first of these is the tabernacle. If we return to Exodus, we hear the story of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, looking for their home. And what do we find in that moment? We find them receiving instructions to build the tabernacle, a portable dwelling place, symbolizing God's presence among his people. And if you look at the instructions of how they were to build it, it's recreating an image of Eden. The first place where God and his people were present together. And so it's a shift for God's people. They place this dwelling place, this meeting place, it's what the word tabernacle means, at the center of their life, the center of their camp. They arrange their life, their rituals and traditions around this place, a place which would put them in the presence of God. But the only problem with the tabernacle was the barrier for entry, this division between the holy and unholy. God's domain and humanity. And so as you look to the tabernacle, there's only the priests can go into the hot spot, the Holy of Holies. There's purity rituals, there's sacrifices, and nonetheless, it's a consistent overlap. God's domain and humanity's domain, heaven and earth. And as we move from the tabernacle, we arrive at the temple. After the Israelites have made it to the promised land, after David has killed Goliath, he's become king, and then his son, Solomon, becomes king. What does Solomon do? He builds a temple to replace the tabernacle, a permanent temple, marble, gold, and silver, massive in scale. And we read in 1 Kings that once it's built, the presence of God arrives. And as the presence of God shows up, Solomon says this, he questions his own work. He says, will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I've built? Where will God dwell? Where can we find his presence? Solomon, even having built the temple, he's convinced the presence of God is too great for this, too great even for the skies, the highest heavens. We've returned back to Psalm 139 a few times these months, and hear these words again. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. Bigger than the tabernacle, bigger than the temple, bigger than the heavens, down in the depths, where can we find the presence of God? Where is God's house? It's in the garden. It's outside the garden. It's in the tabernacle, but outside. It's in the temple, but outside the temple, in the heavens, in the depths. Where do we find it? And then in that same temple, at the festival of Passover, we encounter Jesus, a story in his life. When he arrives at the temple for the festival and he finds that the merchants, the vendors who would gather to do business outside the temple have moved their business inside the temple. And this is the famous scene. He's got a handmade whip and he flips the tables and he says, "Stop turning my Father's house." He identifies the location. "Stop turning my Father's house into a market." And the response he gets is who do you think you are? On what authority can you tell us what this place is and what we can do in it? And as the story goes, Jesus replies, "Destroy this temple, and I'll raise it again in 3 days." And for the confused Jews who hear that word and the confused among us, John gives us the answer. He says that the temple Jesus had spoken of was his body. Tear it down, and in 3 days I'll raise it again, a foreshadow of his death and resurrection, the fulfillment of why the temple existed. And so Jesus had claimed inside the temple that his body was the temple, the true temple where God's presence truly dwelt. And this is how John and the other disciples come to see this man, Jesus. John chapter 1, verse 14 says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." This man is dwelling among us, and this man is the Word made flesh. The word dwelling here in John is the same word for tabernacle in Exodus. The tabernacle is among us. Jesus has answered Solomon's question, will God really dwell on earth? Now God is dwelling on earth in the form of a person, in front of these people, a person that we can meet and know and see and experience. The presence of God is found in a person, and so how do we find where he lives? How do we find where he lives, and what does it mean to dwell in the house of the Lord? The answer to both is we look to Jesus. How do we find where he lives? He's dwelling on earth in the person of Jesus. How do we find where he lives? We found him. We found him. And when we look to him, when we look to Jesus, what do we find? I think we find two things. First is that we find who he is, and he's been telling us all along. We've been going back to Psalm 139, and again, we've been going back to John 10, and we've specifically been picking up the shepherd language. John 10, verse 11, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and they know me. But just before that, a couple of verses before that, how does Jesus describe himself? He says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. He'll go in and out and find pasture. I'm the way in, Jesus says. I'm the way into where God lives, an experience of the dwelling of God, the presence of God. For those who long for a home in the house of God, Jesus is the front door. He's in front of us. He's who we find. And he goes on, in verse 8, he says, there are others who came before me, thieves and robbers. He draws this idea out in verse 10. We've heard these familiar words. There are others, the thief comes only to steal, to kill, and destroy, but I've come that you'd have life, and that you would have abundant life. And so first, when we look to Jesus, we find out who he is. He's the shepherd and he's the door. But second, we find his way of life. He draws out these two options for us, these two realities, a way of building our own homes. False prophets, false teaching, false hopes, up and against finding a home in him. A reality for many of us is we've been living in houses that were never meant to be our home. The enemy who seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. Houses that were never meant to be our home. False promises, false hopes. Homes, houses constructed out of our own ambition. Achievement and productivity and perfection that only lead to anxiety, unhealth, and exhaustion. This has been our argument all year long. Here's some words that we began the year in and again began the summer in. Busyness for us is a sign of social status, a false house. Hurry is a badge of honor, a false house. Ongoing productivity has become our idol, a false house. Maximizing our capacity is more important than the development of our character. It's a false house that we've constructed for ourselves. And yet, we've named, we're perhaps maybe the most restless, exhausted, anxious, fearful, worn out, burned out, troubled, disturbed, uneasy, distracted, worried, agitated. So quite the list, y'all. It's who we are. It's the house we find ourselves in. The enemy who seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. And at the same time, we're radically deficient in the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. What house are we living in? Our self-constructed houses rooted in hurry only harm us and we feel it. It's been our argument all year. Our self-constructed houses rooted in hurry will only harm us, and many of us have experienced it, and many of us long for a new home. C.S. Lewis says it this way about this longing for a new way, a new life. He says, if we find ourselves with the desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we're made for a different world. If the house you're living in is not satisfying, it's only leading you to exhaustion, perhaps you were made to live in a different home. The enemy versus the good shepherd, the thief versus the good shepherd. In Luke 15, we find a story of a father with two sons. And the younger son, the younger of the two, demands his inheritance early. And most of us know how this story goes. He goes off and we read that he squanders his money on wild living. He constructs for himself houses that he thinks will satisfy. And at the end of his rope, he decides there's got to be a different way. There's got to be a better home for me to build a life in. And he thinks, maybe I can just go back to the home where my father lives. And as he walks back, he comes up with his script. He says, I'm going to go back to my father and say, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Do you remember David's words? I'd rather be a doorkeeper than live anywhere else. Make me like one of your hired servants. He walks back home battered, broken, helpless, and hungry, just wanting to be home. to live in a different house. And when he gets near the house, as the story goes, the father runs out to greet him, and he has a party prepared, and he says, "This son of mine was dead, but has now come back to life. He was lost and has now been found." He's found his home. Let's celebrate and rejoice that my son has returned. And like the father in Luke 15, God sees his children hurting. He sees you and me in our hurried hurting. And in his goodness and mercy, he invites us to come home and rest. He invites us to come back to life, to be found. He knows that the house of hurry will always and only harm us. So he welcomes us home, trusting that his presence will heal us. And so at the end of this summer, at the end of Psalm 23, the end of this series, a year-long commitment to Sabbath, what does any of this have to do with Sabbath? I spent some time on TripAdvisor.com this week, and I learned a term that's called the Jerusalem Rush. And the Jerusalem Rush, if you find yourself in Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon, behind the scenes, a lot is happening. Elevators are turning off. Public transportation is stopping their routes. The world is coming to a halt for those who live in Jerusalem. And so you'll find people rushing home, running down the streets and sidewalks to prepare for Sabbath. And so they're running to the grocery store to get last-minute things to prepare a meal. They're rushing home to clean so that they don't have to clean the next day on their Sabbath. They get home, they rush home, and when they do, they light a candle and they wait. They wait for the sun to set. Ancient Jewish rabbis have always described Sabbath as a homecoming. So the Jerusalem Rush is an entire city, an entire network of communities going home. They're rushing home, a whole city returning to rest, returning to dwell in the house. They have resolved to dwell there. They've experienced the good and mercy of the Sabbath and the presence of God and one another that they find there, and they keep going back to be healed from their hurry. They settle in for their perfectly timed day each week, wherein they who are prone to wander as we are once again welcomed back into the loving embrace of their Creator. The Sabbath for them is a structured reminder to return to their God, to their Father who welcomes and loves and calls them beloved. They and we don't commit, we don't attempt the practice of Sabbath to earn our way in. We don't practice the Sabbath to earn anything. We commit because of where it positions us. It brings us home to the presence of the one who can heal us from our hurry and our hurt. One pastor says it this way: no spiritual discipline can make God love you. It's too late. He already does. But spiritual disciplines can help us live in that love. And so for those in Jerusalem, they hurry home to experience it, to rest in that love. And that's the posture of David's heart. Again, a transformed heart here in verse 6. I shall dwell here, he says, in the house of the Lord. These are words of assurance. I've found my home and I'm staying here. But it's also a mindset and a statement of intent. I have nowhere else to go. It's so good here. Why would I go anywhere else? I'm going to run home here. We started the year talking about this practice, an invitation to build into a full 24 hours given to the presence of God and one another. And those first few months, those first weeks, as I sat, even just talking about stories of the meal, the Sabbath meal, where families are blessing one another, I think it's not a surprise, it's not random, that most of those stories were punctuated by tears. And those tears were rooted in an expression, an experience of love, a fulfillment of a longing that they only found when they went home. To be with one another, to be found in the presence of God. And so the question for us at the end of the summer, as we continue in this year focusing on the Sabbath, the question is, will you come home? will you come home? To the God who sees you hurting in self-constructed houses, will you come home? Will you come home? And I believe the way home is the way of surrender. I believe a Sabbath heart is a surrendered heart. I think David knew it, and I think the prodigal son knew it. They knew that they had to decide, they had to surrender the houses they were living in and fix their eyes on running home to their father. Say, just let me in. Just let me in. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. So will you come home? Will you come home to the way you were made to live? Yes, to work and to create, to build, but to rest. To move and to manage, but to relent. 6 days on, 1 day off. Recommit to the Sabbath practice, trusting that God's presence and love will meet you there. Will you go home? We began this series many weeks ago with a breath prayer. In the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Inhaling, the Lord is my shepherd. Exhaling, I shall not want. And I want us to end in that same place. And if it's helpful, I want to offer a breath prayer to you. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. A statement of intent to keep running home into the embrace of the one who calls you a beloved son and daughter. So as we sing, I want to invite you to pray, even just that breath prayer, but consider, reflect on the state of your heart. Is it hurt and hurried? Receive the invitation from a God who loves you to come home. Would you pray with me? God, we relinquish control of our lives, trusting that the way to come home is the way of surrender. And in our surrendering, we find that you are in control and that we can rest. Father, we want to surrender the houses we've built for ourselves, our striving for security, and we want to name our longing for your presence. We weren't supposed to build for ourselves. We were only ever supposed to follow. So would you lead us to the home that you've prepared for us? Would you speak over us again and again and again? The invitation to come home.